former slave, would be required to give way to an upper-ranking woman in recognition of her higher status. Aha, I thought, this is it. But I wanted proof. Thankfully, I had discovered not much later the work of Emily Himmelreich, who I had mentioned earlier. In her book, Hidden Lives, Public Persona, she draws out this idea that social class was instrumental for some women to exercise great power. She gives the example of Lucius and Verena from Apuleius' Metamorphoses. A certain Lucius finds himself in a city called Hypata and bumps into an older woman whom he eventually discovers to be his aunt. Though he doesn't recognize her at first, he immediately notes her high status. In Himmelreich's words, quote, "Her jewelry and costly dress, woven with gold thread, and the large group of attendants in her train all betray her rank and social importance. As a well-bred young man, Lucius shows great respect, blushing and modestly bowing his head. He is shy to greet the unknown lady, even when asked to do so." End quote. She goes on. Verena puts her house and social connections at Lucius's disposal, sending him gifts and inviting him to her dinner parties. Lucius is duly impressed by the magnificence of her great mansion and its costly works of art. Verena is presented as a prominent figure in local society, as the first lady, the primus femina of her own town. She was very much in the public eye, even in her own house, end quote. Now, technically, Apuleius' Metamorphoses is a work of fiction, but the settings and cultural dynamics are realistic to the time. The character Verena was a familiar type of elite woman. Put another way, everyone knew a Verena, a high society lady with money and power. New Testament scholars Margaret MacDonald and Carolyn Osiak put this matter in perspective. We are accustomed to thinking systemically about women in this society in terms of gender dichotomies in a gender-based hierarchical structure. But in face of the evidence, we can only conclude that women of sufficient social status in the Roman world exercised a great deal of freedom and power with regard to business and social activities. That's it, I thought. That's the concept I finally learned that helped me put the pieces together. It's not enough to talk of Roman patriarchy. That is only part of the sociocultural power index. We must also overlay class, and then we have a more complete construct. Not just Roman patriarchy, but Roman class patriarchy. Social class was a recognized key that sometimes unlocked doors for women. In other cases where doors remain locked, social class combined with a dash of grit opened a window. Add to that the fact that the Romans allowed for and approved of social mobility, their own version of rags to riches. Two areas are significant for this: business and patronage. Yes, a woman's place was in the home in the Roman world, but women and men could and did conduct business from their homes. Think about a modern-day therapist or masseuse that works out of their home. Think about, and we have evidence of women in the marketplace peddling their wares. Women participated also in something called patronage, which were relationships of mutual benefit where a patron would lend a hand to a client in return for loyalty. Women, we know, were clients, but sometimes women became patrons of both women and men. If official and formal means of self-advancement were blocked, some women found their way through the cracks of patriarchy to elevate their rank and acquire power. I'll say that in because it sounds familiar for today, doesn't it? If official and formal means of self-advancement were blocked, some women found their way through the cracks of patriarchy to elevate their rank and acquire more social power. Okay, it's time to take a breath and take stock. I want to reiterate that I am in no way erasing the hardships or evils of Roman patriarchy. It wasn't good for women. It wasn't equal for women. It was bad for women. Men ruled and women survived as best they could. But what I have argued is that there is another dimension to Roman patriarchy: class and social power. We ought not to have a little house on the prairie view of the world that saw the birth of the church. Women were not consigned to making babies in the home. Yes, domestic cultivation was a typical Roman virtue for women. But so was industry, and women sometimes showed their hard work in business, politics, religious leadership, and civic benefaction. So you might be wondering, what does this mean for Christianity? By and large, we can say that the New Testament demonstrates that the apostles were not in the business of being more socially restrictive in the church than the wider culture. Put another way, what if a Plancia Magna or a Eumakia found themselves visiting a church in the first century? How would they be received? How would they be perceived? If they happened to come to faith in Jesus Christ, what would the apostles tell them about their lifestyle? Would they say, Eumakia, retire from public life, submit to your husband, and take care of your children? Actually, from our New Testament evidence, that does not seem to be the case. The apostles appear to have strategically relied on widows of means to support the gospel mission. Think about the quote-unquote mother of Mark, whose house became a hub of Christian leadership in Judea, according to Acts 12. Or the Philippian woman Lydia, another widow, clearly a woman of some wealth and probably of high status. Quickly, her house became a ministry center as well. Or we could talk about Phoebe of Romans 16. Is she married? We don't know. Why is her husband not named in Romans 16? Why does Paul send a woman from Cenchrea to Rome when he had other options at his disposal? I think it is more than reasonable to recognize that Phoebe was a woman of means, more than capable of traveling and supporting and extending Paul's apostolic work in Rome. Roman society allowed for this. But furthermore, I think it was a practical outworking of Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Neither Jew nor Gentile, neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. In Christ, Paul would say, we must see structures of social power differently. The master is no more important than the slave. The Jew not more esteemed before God than the Gentile, and vice versa. And the woman is not beneath the man. Despite some allowances for class power in Roman society, Romans didn't really see women as equal to men. But Paul did. We will be talking at length about that in the next lecture. But as we wrap up this first lecture, I want to leave you thinking about a fascinating incident in the early years of the 2nd century A.D. Pliny the Younger was a magistrate in the province of Bithynia. We have a letter that he wrote to Emperor Trajan, the Roman Emperor Trajan, to seek his advice about how to treat Christians. Specifically, whether he had the authority to execute Christians at will for their strange religion. This is letter 96. Pliny the Younger makes reference to taking 2 women into custody for questioning, torturing them for information. 2 details about these women are particularly interesting to me for our discussion today. First, they are called ministry, which means something like deacons. They were church leaders. On what level and capacity, we don't exactly know. They bore some responsibility for caring for their Christian community as leaders. So just take a moment to ponder that phenomenon that when Pliny goes looking for Christians, he finds 2 women leaders, 2 ministry, 2 deacons. Second element that's really interesting, maybe even more interesting, is that Pliny remarks that they were ancilli, which means household slaves. From a Roman perspective, this is unusual to have leaders in an organization that were also slaves. And this simply cannot be accounted for in the Roman mind. Slaves, by definition and legal categorization, had no dignity, honor, or respect. In fact, Aristotle famously referred to slaves as living tools. And there's one modern scholar, Laura Nasrallah, that said that according to their categorization, they weren't people, they were person things. But here we have Pliny happening upon 2 women leaders who are ancilli. But Christians like Paul afforded slaves dignity. And some 80 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, 2 slave women serve as ministry deacons in their church. So I want to leave you with these questions as we close the first lecture. Do we respect our women Christian leaders now the way these Bithynian churches did in the 2nd century AD? We've hidden their lives, and it is beyond time to bring them out of the shadows, to honor and celebrate the intrepid and inspiring women of faith in our shared Christian heritage. Thank you. I can repeat the question, too. You're just also compelled. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is for our YouTube folks is, what do we know about Christian attitudes towards slaves and leadership in terms of slaves? My expertise is not in the 2nd century, which is what Pliny was from, but I can talk a little bit about the 1st century. So I've been doing a lot of work on Philemon, this short letter, 350 words in Greek. But we actually learn a lot from this letter about this Christian attitudes towards slaves, because in the letter to Philemon, what you have is a slave master who's a Christian leader, probably of his own church. We'll talk about this in the second lecture, named Philemon. And what happened in the background of the letter, if you're just not on the tip of your tongue, is Philemon had a slave named Onesimus. And Onesimus was not a Christian. And then Onesimus finds his way to Paul somehow. We don't know if he was sent to Paul to help him. We don't know if he ran away. We just don't know the situation. But we know that when he comes to encounter Paul, who's in prison, that Paul shares the gospel, maybe again. Maybe Onesimus has heard the gospel, but he shares the gospel with him. And we know that Onesimus becomes a Christian. And Paul then wants there to be reconciliation and a newfound relationship between Onesimus and Philemon. So Paul sends Onesimus home, back to Philemon. And the letter is all about inspiring and encouraging Philemon to reconcile. And I think it's verse 16 where it says, receive him back as more than a slave, as a beloved brother. And so what we think is that Paul is trying to say, he's a Christian now. He's just like you in many ways. And to treat him as a brother would be to transform the household relationship and to destabilize and throw off balance his status as slave. Now, scholars are actually divided on whether Paul was kind of in a roundabout way telling Philemon to give him his freedom. We call that manumission. So about a third of the scholars think, yes, he was trying to set him free. And then another percentage thinks, no, he was just saying, whether you set him free or not, you need to change your relationship. Well, what we think is this would have been apostolic value to begin to treat people differently, which then opens the way for slaves to become leaders. But the fact that Paul's writing this letter means there would be pushback as well, because there would be that feeling that slaves are subhuman. I did ministry work in Eastern Europe, where there, in the country I was in, Macedonia, there were ethnic Macedonians and ethnic Albanians, and they hate each other. And the Macedonians treat the Albanians as less than human. And so in the Christian churches, Macedonians and Albanians sit together, but in society they stay separate. And I think we see a similar thing like that going on with social power. In the first century, you have Paul, working with women and working with slaves and saying things about slaves that people didn't say, like they're useful, they're valuable, they have dignity. So to answer your question, I think there would be tensions there because people have such long preformed perceptions of slaves as lazy, dumb, greedy, all those kinds of things, just like we might say of a particular country or a particular type of person, they're this and that and the other. Like we have jokes about blondes or jokes about people from various countries. They have these stereotypes. And it would be hard to overcome those stereotypes. But if you're interested, there's a really fun book called Lost Letters from Pergamum, which is a set of fictional letters between the apostle, the Christian leader Luke, and a non-Christian that he's having a conversation with. And he encourages this person to visit some churches. And so he visits a church that basically is Christian in name only, but maintains the social structures of society. And Luke says, no, you have to go to a real church. And then he goes to a real church where there's more social equality and community. And so I think that's realistic. I think in the first century you might go to churches and they save the best seats in the house for the wealthy and the elite. And what does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 11? He says, when you get together for the Lord's Supper, what's happening is that some people eat a lot and then other people go hungry. He says, don't you have houses to eat at? So when you come together, you share equally. He says this in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 as well. He says, not that some have more and some have less, but everybody has enough. And so Paul is really trying hard to do this. So I think in some places where Paul's message really took root, you're going to have leaders, kind of on the lower end of society because they're really taking seriously the truth of the gospel. And I think there's some churches where they're not. We have time for one more. A good, juicy question. Go ahead. There's a theory called, we're getting deep now, there's a theory called exclusionary koinonia, which means one theory is that Philemon had a blind spot in the sense that he was a church leader. He maybe hosted a house church with 15, 20 people, but he had a bias against slaves. So you think about civil rights era U.S. You might have a great Christian leader, but they have a bias against black people or something like that. So, wonderful person, everybody talks well about them, they have a good heart, but they have this blind spot and they just say, oh, I don't want to interact with those kind of people. And so one idea is that maybe he even harmed his slaves, maybe, he had this bias, and then Onesimus goes running away to Paul to say, what should we do? And then, this is actually a helpful case study for us today. I'm doing some writing on this right now, where we think about how it's so easy to go online and social media and just lob grenades at people from afar. And Paul could have just torn Philemon to shreds in this letter and said, you are a horrible person, how dare you, I never want to talk to you again. But he starts off the letter saying, you're famous for your love for the saints. You're famous for your hospitality. You're famous for refreshing the hearts of believers. He says, wouldn't we expect that of you in this situation too? And so I like using, even though I think you're right that this is troubling, I think it's a really helpful lesson to us to rethink, okay, how do we start interacting today with people? Because I think our go-to reaction is condemn. And to make people out to be completely good or bad. So I use the example, so this might be too pop culture for some of you, but I use the example of Karate Kid and Cobra Kai. So I grew up in the Karate Kid era, right, with Ralph Macchio. And when you watch the movies from the 80s, it's very good versus evil, black and white, right? You know the good guys and the bad guys. And the good guys are sometimes go astray, but they're pretty much good, and the bad guys are bad. And then they started this TV show, Cobra Kai, which I like very much, watch it with my family. And they messed that whole paradigm up. And they say, you don't know who to root for. And because sometimes the Cobra Kai is trying to do the right thing, but then go astray. Sometimes our normal good guys, the Miyagi clan, are doing some bad things. And it's hard, but it's also realistic, right? That this is the way we are. We're people who have blind spots, but we're not bad people. And so this kind of helps me see the early Christian world differently, to be able to say, okay, people weren't perfect just like they aren't today. How are we going to help people see the light under those circumstances? And so, I really resonate with that. It is troubled me as well. And Paul didn't say treat him well because he's human. He said, essentially, he's now a Christian brother. But I think at that time, what he was trying to say was, let your Christian faith let you see him in a different way. And that's, we have to be okay with where they're moving in the right direction, is what I would say.
All right, we're going to take a 12-minute break. We will start again right at 11 o'clock with